This story is titled, My Ex-Wife Poisoned Our Daughter Against Me with False Stories, Making Her Hate Me and Side Only with Mom. As she searched for her new boyfriend, I legally cut off all alimony payments. Subreddit, my name is Marcus, and I'm 39 years old. For most of my adult life, I thought I had everything figured out. I had built a solid business from the ground up, maintained what I believed was a good marriage, and had spent 13 years raising a daughter I loved with all my heart. Then, in the span of just 1 week, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down around me. This isn't just another story about infidelity, though that's certainly part of it. It's not even just about discovering that my wife had been defending her affair. The reality goes much deeper than that, cutting to the very core of who I thought I was and what my life actually meant. What I'm about to share is the story of how 19 years of marriage completely shattered, and how I learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from the people you trust most. I own a vintage motorcycle parts shop here in Tucson, Arizona. It's not glamorous work, but it's something I built from absolutely nothing through sheer determination and countless hours of labor. Before opening my own place, I spent years working as a mechanic for another dealer, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. For 22 years now, I've been putting in 65-hour weeks, grinding through economic recessions and watching competitors fold while I found ways to expand and adapt. My shop specializes in authenticated classic Harley-Davidson parts and vintage Indian motorcycle memorabilia. It's a niche market, but one that's proven surprisingly profitable over the years. Nothing flashy or trendy, just honest business serving collectors and enthusiasts who appreciate quality and authenticity. I now have 4 employees working for me, and our reputation brings in serious collectors from across the entire Southwest region. I first met Victoria when I was 22 years old. She was 19 at the time, young and absolutely stunning, in a way that made heads turn whenever she walked into a room. We dated for 2 years before getting married, and during that courtship period, I was just starting to establish myself in business. At the time, I was living in a modest 2-bedroom house that I'd been able to purchase using an inheritance from my uncle. My father, having witnessed 4 of his close friends get completely financially destroyed in bitter divorce proceedings, insisted that I protect myself with a prenuptial agreement. Son, he told me with the gravity of someone who'd seen too much, a man protects his assets before he needs to, not after the damage is done. When I brought up the subject with Victoria, she agreed to the prenup without much argument, which I took as a positive sign at the time. Eventually, we worked out what seemed like fair and reasonable terms. The prenuptial agreement stated that anything I brought into the marriage would remain solely mine, including the house I'd purchased and the business I was building. However, anything we acquired together during our marriage would be split 50-50 if we ever divorced. At the time, this arrangement seemed perfectly fair and reasonable to both of us. That inheritance from my uncle wasn't just money to me. It represented the culmination of his entire life's work and sacrifice. He'd worked hard for decades to build something meaningful, and I wasn't about to gamble that legacy away on romantic optimism alone. For 19 years, Victoria and I had what I genuinely believed was a solid, stable marriage. She worked her way up from an entry-level position to manager at a high-end jewelry store downtown, while I focused on expanding the motorcycle business. Together, we built a comfortable life that exceeded both of our original expectations. I bought us a bigger house in a much better neighborhood, and we were able to take vacations to places Victoria had always dreamed of visiting. We made trips to Cancun and Jamaica, soaking up the sun and enjoying the kind of relaxation that felt well-earned after years of hard work. For our 12th anniversary, I surprised her with a 3-week European vacation that took us through countries she'd only seen in magazines. These weren't just expensive trips for the sake of showing off. They represented the life we were building together, the dreams we were making reality through our combined efforts. Our relationship had comfortable routines that gave structure to our weeks and months. Saturday morning rides became our sacred time together, just the 2 of us exploring the desert highways on my bike with Victoria holding tight behind me. We established Thanksgiving traditions that brought both our families together, and our summer barbecues with the neighbors became neighborhood events that people looked forward to each year. We had cultivated a solid group of friends, mostly other couples we'd known since our 20s, and our social life felt rich and fulfilling. Looking back now, I realized there were warning signs that I completely missed, but at the time I was too busy building our life to pay attention to the subtle changes in Victoria's behavior. I started catching her staring at her phone with a slight smile playing across her lips, only to quickly lock the screen and put it away whenever I walked into the room. I began noticing how she would step away to take certain phone calls, moving to another room and speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't quite make out. There were also those networking events she started attending with increasing frequency. She'd dress up in her best clothes and come home hours later, but somehow never seemed to have collected a single business card or made any concrete connections that translated into actual business opportunities. These inconsistencies should have raised red flags, but I dismissed them because I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. It's a classic mistake that I'm sure countless other husbands have made. When you don't want to believe something devastating about your spouse, your mind finds ways to explain away even the most obvious evidence. Our daughter Jessica arrived 3 years after Victoria and I got married, and from the moment she was born, she became the center of our world. I always thought she looked more like Victoria than me, but that's not unusual. Kids can be unpredictable when it comes to inherited features, and sometimes genetics skip around in ways that surprise everyone. I never questioned Jessica's parentage because there was absolutely no reason to. Why would any father doubt something so fundamental about his own child? I raised Jessica exactly like any devoted father would raise his daughter. I was there when she took her first steps, cheering her on and catching her when she stumbled. I spent countless hours helping her with homework, making sure she understood everything from basic math to more complex subjects as she got older. I taught her how to ride a bike, running alongside her in the driveway until she found her balance and could pedal away on her own, with confidence and joy. One of the things I'm most proud of is how I shared my passion for vintage motorcycles with her. I showed her how to identify authentic vintage bike parts, teaching her the subtle differences between original components and modern reproductions. Every summer, I would take her camping in the Sonoran Desert, just the two of us under the vast Arizona sky, building campfires and telling stories while she learned to appreciate the beauty of the wilderness. When Jessica was younger, we were incredibly close. She would hang around the shop after school, fascinated by the work I was doing and eager to learn everything I could teach her. She absorbed information like a sponge, learning how to spot fake parts and understand the differences between original Harley-Davidson and Indian motorcycle components. Those afternoons in the shop, with Jessica asking endless questions and showing genuine interest in my work, were some of the happiest times of my life. By the time she turned 9 years old, Jessica had developed an almost supernatural ability to authenticate vintage motorcycle parts. I would test her skills by presenting her with mixed batches of authentic and reproduction parts, challenging her to separate the real from the fake. She would nail these assessments 8 times out of 10, pointing out flaws that even experienced collectors might miss. "The chrome's all wrong for that era," she'd say with confidence, or "Look at the casting. It's way too clean for something that's supposed to be from 1952. Watching her develop that expertise made me incredibly proud, and I saw it as evidence of the strong bond we shared. Everything started to change when Jessica turned 12 years old. What I initially dismissed as normal preteen rebellion began to feel like something more deliberate and concerning. The close relationship we'd enjoyed for years started to deteriorate, and I found myself constantly wondering where I'd gone wrong as a father. One particular Friday stands out in my memory as a turning point. I asked Jessica to help me at the shop during what was going to be a busy vintage bike show weekend. These events were always exciting for both of us, or at least they used to be. Instead of the enthusiasm I'd come to expect, Jessica rolled her eyes dramatically and delivered a response that cut deeper than I was prepared for. "Why would I waste my weekend with your boring old junk when no one at school even cares about that stuff?" she said, with the kind of dismissive tone that teenagers have perfected into an art form. The words stung more than I wanted to admit, especially coming from the same girl who had spent countless hours eagerly learning everything I could teach her about vintage motorcycles. Before I could even respond to defend myself or the work that provided for our family, Victoria immediately jumped to Jessica's defense. "You're being too demanding," she told me firmly. "Preteens need their space, and you can't expect her to share all your interests forever. She's growing up and developing her own identity." I backed off, telling myself that Victoria was probably right and that this was just a normal phase that all parents go through with their teenage children. I convinced myself that Jessica would come around eventually, that her interest in the shop and our shared activities would return once she got through whatever adolescent struggles she was facing. Unfortunately, things only escalated as Jessica approached her 13th birthday. The attitude I'd hoped was temporary seemed to be becoming a permanent fixture of her personality. One afternoon, I discovered something that made me realize this wasn't just typical teenage rebellion. It was a fundamental lack of respect for things that mattered deeply to me. I caught Jessica showing her friends my prized 1948 panhead engine, which I kept locked in a secure cabinet in the garage office. This wasn't just any piece of motorcycle history, it was one of my most valuable and historically significant possessions. When I confronted her about how she'd gained unauthorized access to the secured parts cabinet, her response showed a level of defiance that genuinely shocked me. "It's just for show, and God, you're so uptight about everything," she snapped, showing no understanding of what she'd done wrong. Her casual dismissal of my concerns was bad enough, but what happened next made the situation even worse. Once again, Victoria immediately stepped in to defend Jessica's behavior rather than supporting me as her husband and Jessica's father. "She wasn't going to hurt anyone," Victoria said dismissively. "Stop making everything into a federal case. You're completely overreacting to something harmless." What Victoria failed to grasp, and what I struggled to explain to both of them, was that this wasn't about teenage rebellion or harmless curiosity. This was about respect for historically significant items that were worth tens of thousands of dollars. That panhead engine wasn't just a piece of metal sitting in my garage. It was a documented piece of motorcycle history that had been used in early Sturgis rallies, complete with provenance that I'd spent years researching and verifying. But trying to explain the historical and financial significance of these artifacts to a wife who consistently referred to my life's work as old junk felt like an impossible task. Victoria had never understood my passion for vintage motorcycles, and she certainly didn't appreciate the expertise and dedication required to authenticate and preserve pieces of automotive history. The distance between Jessica and me continued to grow wider with each passing month. She started missing our weekend breakfast rides, which had been a cherished tradition since she was 7 years old. These Saturday morning adventures had been our special time together, just father and daughter exploring the Arizona countryside and stopping at little diners for pancakes and conversation. One particular Sunday morning, I knocked on Jessica's bedroom door at 8:30 a.m., our usual departure time for these rides. "Breakfast ride is ready," I called through the door, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice despite my growing concern about our relationship. "I've got your favorite trail mix packed and ready to go." Instead of the excitement these words used to generate, I heard only a muffled, uninterested response from under the covers. "Not interested," Jessica mumbled, making it clear that sleep was more important to her than spending time with me. I tried one more time, hoping to recapture some of the enthusiasm we used to share. "Come on. I made your favorite trail mix with the dried cranberries and almonds you like so much." I waited hopefully by her door, remembering all the times she'd bounded out of bed excited for our adventures together. This time, Jessica emerged from her room, but instead of the sleepy enthusiasm I was hoping for, she glared at me with what can only be described as pure contempt. "Can you just stop?" she said with exasperation. "I don't want your trail mix, and I'm not a little kid anymore. When are you going to figure that out?" Later that same day, I happened to overhear a conversation between Victoria and Jessica that revealed just how much my relationship with my daughter had deteriorated. They didn't realize I was standing in the hallway, close enough to hear their words but hidden from their view. Victoria was consoling Jessica, speaking in the kind of sympathetic tone that suggested I was the problem in this situation. "Your dad just doesn't understand that you're growing up," Victoria explained to our daughter. "He still thinks you're his little girl, and he doesn't know how to handle the fact that you're becoming an independent young woman." Jessica's response cut deeper than any of her direct confrontations with me had managed to do. "He's so boring, Mom," she said, with genuine frustration in her voice. "All he does is work and talk about stupid old bikes that nobody cares about. It's embarrassing." Standing there in the hallway, listening to my wife and daughter discuss me like I was some kind of burden they had to tolerate, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. These weren't just the normal growing pains of a father watching his daughter mature. This felt like a deliberate campaign to diminish my role in Jessica's life and mock the work that provided for our family. The situation continued to deteriorate as the months passed. Another incident that really drove home how much our relationship had changed involved an authentication seminar in Scottsdale that Jessica and I were supposed to attend together. This was the kind of educational event that she'd been genuinely excited about the year before, eager to learn more about the technical aspects of vintage motorcycle restoration and authentication. The morning we were scheduled to leave for the seminar, I went to Jessica's room to wake her up, expecting the usual rush to get ready for what had once been an anticipated father-daughter outing. Instead, I found her refusing to get out of bed, pulling the covers over her head and acting like I was disturbing her for no good reason. When I finally managed to get her up and moving, thinking maybe she just needed a few minutes to wake up properly, she delivered another crushing blow to what remained of our relationship. "I don't care about your stupid motorcycle crap anymore," she snapped with genuine anger in her voice. It's embarrassing, and I'm not going to waste my day listening to a bunch of old guys talk about rusty junk that nobody my age cares about. Once again, Victoria intervened on Jessica's behalf instead of supporting me as her husband. She pulled me aside and delivered what felt like a lecture about my parenting approach. "You need to stop pushing your interests on our daughter," Victoria told me firmly. "She's developing her own identity, and you need to accept that she's not going to be your mini-me forever. Let her be her own person." The message was clear. My passion for vintage motorcycles, the work that provided for our family, and the expertise I'd spent decades developing were nothing more than an inconvenience that Jessica shouldn't be expected to tolerate. Once again, I backed off, telling myself that maybe Victoria was right, and that I needed to give Jessica more space to find her own interests. Then, the mysterious trips to Albuquerque started, and everything began to make more sense in retrospect. Beginning in March, Victoria started taking what she described as girls' weekends with her college friends. 4 weekends in the span of 3 months, each trip supposedly involving a group of women getting together to reminisce about old times and catch up on each other's lives. Each time Victoria returned from these Albuquerque trips, she came back with a shopping bag from Nordstrom, evidence of what she claimed were group shopping expeditions with her girlfriends. But when I looked at our credit card statements, the purchases didn't match up with the stories she was telling me. The receipts I occasionally found in her purse were for lunch for one person, not the group brunches with multiple college friends that she described in such elaborate detail. As these trips became more frequent, I started noticing other changes in Victoria's behavior that should have been obvious red flags. She began taking phone calls in other rooms, speaking in hushed tones and ending conversations abruptly when I walked into earshot. Her wardrobe started changing as well, with new clothes appearing regularly that somehow never made an appearance when we went out together as a couple. I know now that these are classic signs of infidelity, textbook behaviors that anyone with experience in these matters would recognize immediately. But at the time, I kept making excuses and finding rational explanations for each inconsistency. We'd been married for 19 years, we had built a life together, we had a daughter and a home and shared history. People don't just throw all of that away for a fling, right? That's what I kept telling myself, even as the evidence continued to accumulate. Then Tony, my shop foreman, finally confirmed what I was starting to suspect, but didn't want to believe. He mentioned it casually while we were unpacking a shipment of vintage Indian Scout parts, the kind of routine work conversation that happens dozens of times throughout any given week. "Saw your wife at Rosewood Steakhouse yesterday with some guy in a suit," Tony said, not realizing the bombshell he was dropping. "Seemed pretty friendly with each other, if you know what I mean." I kept my face neutral despite the knot that immediately formed in my gut, trying to process what Tony had just told me without showing how much it affected me. "Oh, really?" I managed to say, continuing to unpack parts like nothing had changed. "Her Albuquerque trip got canceled at the last minute," I lied, providing Tony with an explanation that I knew didn't actually explain anything. That night, after Tony's casual observation had been eating at me for hours, I decided to check our joint credit card statement for the first time in months. There it was, exactly as Tony had described. Rosewood Steakhouse, 178-63, charged on a day when Victoria was supposedly in Albuquerque with her college girlfriends. The amount was too expensive for a casual lunch and too intimate for any kind of business meeting. As I scrolled through more of the recent charges, I noticed several other suspicious transactions. There were multiple charges at a hotel in Tucson, but not the kind of upscale place Victoria and I would choose for a romantic getaway. This was the sort of mid-level hotel you'd pick if you were trying to keep a low profile and avoid being seen by people you might know. I also found frequent charges at a gas station off Interstate 10, roughly halfway between Tucson and Scottsdale. The pattern suggested regular trips between our city and the Phoenix metropolitan area, trips that Victoria had never mentioned to me, and that didn't correspond with any of her stated activities or responsibilities. The pieces were starting to form a picture that I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore any longer. If Victoria was having an affair, there would be digital evidence somewhere. She'd never been particularly tech-savvy, so the chances were good that she wouldn't have been careful enough to completely cover her tracks. When I got home that evening, I found Jessica on the couch texting furiously, completely absorbed in her phone conversation and barely acknowledging my presence. As I walked past her toward the kitchen, a notification popped up on her screen that made my blood run cold. The banner message read, "Derek can't wait to see you guys next weekend." The text disappeared before I could read any more details, but I'd seen enough to know that something significant was happening that I wasn't aware of. When Jessica realized I'd been looking at her phone, She immediately flipped it over and glared at me with the kind of defensive anger that suggested she knew she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "What?" she snapped, as if I was the one invading her privacy rather than simply walking through my own living room. "Who's Derek?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite the alarm bells going off in my head. Jessica's face flushed red, a clear sign that this was a sensitive topic she didn't want to discuss. "Just Mom's friend from work. Why are you snooping?" she replied defensively. "I wasn't snooping," I said calmly. "The notification just popped up while I was walking by." "Whatever," Jessica muttered, getting up from the couch and stomping off to her room, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. That single interaction told me everything I needed to know. The defensive reaction, the flushed face, the immediate retreat to her room, these weren't the behaviors of someone discussing an innocent family friend. Jessica clearly knew more about this Derek person than she was willing to admit, and her loyalty was obviously with her mother rather than with me. I didn't confront Victoria when she got home that evening. Something deep in my gut told me to wait, to gather more information before making any moves that I couldn't take back. Instead, I hugged her when she walked through the door and listened with growing disgust as she told me elaborate lies about spa treatments and shopping excursions with friends who I was now beginning to suspect didn't even exist. That night, with Jessica at a sleepover and the house finally empty and quiet, I made a decision that would change everything. I sat down at Victoria's desk in our home office, my heart pounding as I prepared to cross a line that would fundamentally alter our relationship regardless of what I found. I remembered setting up Victoria's original Facebook account years ago when she wasn't particularly tech-savvy and needed help navigating social media. She'd since switched to a new account using her work email address, probably thinking that I'd forgotten about the old login credentials, or wouldn't think to check an account she no longer used regularly. But I hadn't forgotten anything. After requesting a password reset through the email account that I still had access to, I managed to get into her old Facebook profile. What I discovered there was worse than anything I'd imagined, even in my most paranoid moments over the past few weeks. It didn't take long to find Derek's profile. According to his Facebook page, he was a commercial real estate agent working out of Scottsdale with the kind of polished professional headshots that suggested he made good money and cared about his appearance. But what really caught my attention weren't his profile pictures. It was the message history between him and Victoria. The private messages between them went back 13 months, far longer than I'd suspected. There were hundreds of them, creating a digital paper trail of an affair that had been going on right under my nose for over a year. These weren't just casual flirtations or innocent reconnections between old friends. They were detailed plans for secret meetings, intimate conversations about their feelings for each other, and explicit declarations of love that made me physically sick to read. I forced myself to continue scrolling through their correspondence, even though every message felt like a knife twisting in my chest. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying and devastating, but impossible to look away from. My marriage, my life, everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd loved for 19 years was burning to the ground before my eyes. One message from Victoria to Derek stopped me cold. "I've never stopped loving you, Derek. You know you've always been my true love. Marcus is a good provider, but we never had the passion that you and I shared. I settled because I thought you weren't coming back." The words hit me like a physical blow. Always been her true love? How long had this been going on? Had our entire marriage been built on a lie? I was still processing the implications of that message when I scrolled further and found something even more devastating. Derek had written to Victoria, "What if she's yours?" Victoria's response was, "Derek, that's impossible. The timing doesn't work out." Then Derek replied, "I think." My hands started shaking so badly that I almost dropped the laptop. According to their message history, Victoria and Derek had dated seriously in college before he broke things off to take a job opportunity in California. About 3 months after their breakup, Victoria had met me. But apparently, Derek had come back briefly for what they described as a goodbye weekend before moving to the West Coast permanently. The timing of that goodbye weekend coincided almost exactly with when Victoria became pregnant with Jessica. I closed the laptop and sat there in the darkness of our home office, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd just discovered. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my daughter was potentially built on lies that went back over 14 years. The foundation of my entire adult existence was crumbling beneath me, and I wasn't sure if anything I believed about my family was actually true. But I wasn't going to let emotion drive my next moves. That's exactly how men make catastrophic mistakes that end up costing them everything they've worked for their entire lives. Instead of confronting Victoria immediately or doing something rash that I'd regret later, I decided to approach this situation with the same methodical precision I used in my business. I systematically took screenshots of the most damaging messages between Victoria and Derek, making sure to capture timestamps and context that would be useful if this ended up in legal proceedings. I saved copies of everything to a secure cloud drive that only I could access, creating a digital paper trail that Victoria couldn't delete or deny. Then I carefully cleared the browser history and put the laptop back exactly where I'd found it, making sure that everything appeared undisturbed. Victoria might suspect that I knew something was wrong, but she'd have no concrete proof that I'd accessed her accounts or discovered her affair. By morning, I had developed a plan of action. My first stop was going to be Kevin's office. He'd handled my prenuptial agreement 19 years earlier and had become something of a friend over the years. We'd grab beers occasionally and talk about business, life, and the challenges of maintaining long-term relationships. He was older now, with gray hair at his temples, but his mind was still sharp and his legal expertise was exactly what I needed. I need to see if that prenup is still legally valid, I told him after settling into the chair across from his desk. And I need to arrange for a court-admissible paternity test. Kevin's friendly smile immediately vanished as he processed what I'd just said. The casual beer-drinking buddy disappeared, replaced by the experienced divorce attorney who'd seen too many marriages implode over the years. I showed him the screenshots I'd taken from Victoria's Facebook messages, watching his expression grow more serious with each image. After reviewing the evidence and pulling out the original prenuptial agreement from my file, Kevin gave me his professional assessment. The prenup should hold up in court, he confirmed after carefully reviewing the document. You purchased the house before the marriage, and your business was explicitly protected under the terms you both signed. Any assets you've acquired through the business should remain yours as well. But, he continued, and I could tell there was bad news coming, the second home in Flagstaff that you bought 6 years ago would likely be considered marital property, since you purchased it while married, regardless of whose name is on the deed. The same goes for that rental property downtown that you bought as an investment. I'd almost forgotten about those properties. The mountain house had been Victoria's idea, something she'd wanted for weekend getaways and family vacations. The downtown rental property had been an investment opportunity that had nearly tripled in value over the past few years. Both represented significant assets that I'd apparently be losing in the divorce. And regarding the paternity test? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know my options. I can set that up through the court system, Kevin replied. If the child isn't biologically yours, things get legally complicated. She's 14 now, so we're only talking about potentially 4 years of child support at most. But more importantly, after raising her for 14 years, Arizona courts will likely consider you her legal father, regardless of what the DNA test shows. There's something called the doctrine of paternity by Estoppel that could apply in this situation. So even if she's not mine biologically, I'm still legally and financially responsible for her? I asked, feeling the walls closing in around me. Possibly, Kevin said carefully. But let's get the test results first. Then we can strategize based on what we find out. Kevin immediately filed a petition with the court, requesting a paternity test based on fraud and newly discovered evidence. I provided him with copies of the Facebook messages that suggested Jessica might not be my biological daughter. The judge reviewed our petition and granted a temporary order authorizing the test for legal purposes. Since Jessica was still a minor and under my legal guardianship, the court order allowed me to collect the DNA sample without her explicit consent, as long as the collection process was non-invasive and properly documented according to legal standards. I scheduled the paternity test at the laboratory that Kevin had arranged to work with. Since Victoria wouldn't willingly cooperate with the process, the judge's temporary order allowed for discrete sample collection without her consent, as long as the procedure was non-invasive and properly documented according to legal standards. I waited until Jessica fell asleep one night and used the court-issued swab kit to collect the DNA sample. I carefully followed every single instruction provided by the laboratory to ensure that the sample would be admissible in court and that the chain of custody remained unbroken. The next morning, I personally delivered the sealed sample to the lab, knowing that the results would either confirm my worst fears or put this particular nightmare to rest. Those 3 weeks of waiting for the test results were without question the longest and most agonizing of my entire life. Every day felt like an eternity as I maintained the appearance of normalcy on the outside, while my entire world was potentially crumbling on the inside. I continued going to work, handling customers, and managing my employees as if nothing had changed. even though every interaction felt surreal and disconnected from reality. While I waited for the DNA results, I used the time to strategize and prepare for whatever was coming next. I systematically documented every asset that Victoria and I had accumulated over our 19 years of marriage. I photographed every valuable item in the house that predated our marriage, creating a visual inventory that would support my claims about what belonged to me individually versus what we'd acquired together. I double-checked the deed to our primary residence to ensure it was still solely in my name, as protected by the prenuptial agreement. I spent hours going through 19 years of financial records, meticulously documenting our spending patterns and income contributions. What I discovered was that despite Victoria's steady income from her job at the jewelry store, I had personally paid for approximately 79% of our household expenses over the years. The financial records also revealed something else that infuriated me. Victoria's spending had increased dramatically over the past year, coinciding exactly with when her affair with Derek had begun according to their Facebook messages. There were charges for designer clothes that I'd never seen her wear around me, expensive spa treatments that she'd claimed were work-related, and weekend getaways that were actually secret rendezvous with her lover. I also took inventory of all the jewelry I'd bought Victoria over the years, which totaled approximately $26,000 in gifts. According to Kevin, those would be considered gifts and would therefore remain hers to keep, regardless of how the divorce proceedings went. It was painful to calculate how much money I'd spent over the years on a woman who had been systematically lying to me and planning her exit strategy. Before filing for divorce, Kevin advised me to move half of our joint savings account into a separate account under my name only. However, he insisted that this could only be done after he served formal notice to Victoria's attorney, ensuring full disclosure and compliance with Arizona law. This transparency was crucial to avoid any accusations that I was hiding assets or acting in bad faith during the divorce proceedings. I knew that I had to be absolutely methodical in my approach. I needed to demonstrate to the court that Victoria wasn't just unfaithful, but that she had been actively deceptive about our daughter's paternity and had been using our marital resources to fund her affair. Every step had to be documented and legally defensible. Our longtime family accountant, Robert, proved invaluable during this process. He helped me trace Victoria's spending patterns over the past year, and what we discovered was even worse than I'd initially suspected. Victoria had blown through nearly $34,000 at luxury hotels in Scottsdale and Albuquerque, hotels that I'd never stayed at with her, and that corresponded perfectly with her secret meetings with Derek. Robert gave me a long, knowing look after we finished going through the financial records. "You need me to testify about any of this if it goes to court?" he offered, without hesitation. I nodded gratefully, knowing that having a professional accountant willing to testify about Victoria's financial deception would be another crucial ally in my corner. The call I'd been dreading finally came on a Thursday morning. I was in my shop, carefully authenticating a set of vintage Harley-Davidson badges that a collector had brought in from Phoenix, when Kevin's number flashed on my phone screen. My hands were steady as I answered, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "We have the results, Marcus," Kevin said without any preamble. "You're not Jessica's biological father." Even though I'd suspected this outcome based on the Facebook messages I'd seen, hearing the confirmation felt like taking a shotgun blast directly to the chest. 14 years of memories, Jessica's first steps, teaching her to ride a bike, helping her with school projects, building our father-daughter traditions, suddenly had a shadow cast over them that changed everything about how I understood my own life. I sat down heavily in my office chair, trying to process what this revelation meant for my future and for Jessica's. "What happens now?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "You need to think very carefully about how you want to proceed," Kevin replied. "Challenging paternity after all these years is extremely complicated from a legal standpoint. The courts generally prioritize the child's stability and well-being over biological relationships, especially when the child has lived their entire life believing someone is their father." "I need some time to process all of this," I told him, feeling overwhelmed by the implications of what we'd discovered. "Let's focus on moving forward with the divorce proceedings for now, and we can address the paternity issue later." The truth was that despite everything I'd learned, despite the lies, the betrayal, and the deception, I still loved Jessica deeply. She wasn't just some random child that I'd been tricked into raising through Victoria's manipulation. She was the little girl who had fallen asleep on my chest when she was a baby, who had looked up to me with admiration and trust for most of her childhood, who had shared my passion for vintage motorcycles and had learned to spot authentication details that even experienced collectors missed. But I also now understood that if Victoria had been lying about Jessica's paternity for all these years, she had also probably been systematically poisoning Jessica against me. Those teenage attitude changes and phases of rebellion suddenly looked much more calculated and deliberate. Victoria had been preparing Jessica for this moment, gradually turning her against me so that when the truth finally came out, Jessica would choose Derek over the man who had actually raised her. I hadn't confronted Victoria about any of my discoveries yet, but I knew that confrontation was coming soon. The process server would be delivering divorce papers to her at work the following Tuesday morning, ensuring maximum public impact and giving her no opportunity to prepare her response or hide additional assets. I made sure I would be home when she returned from work that day, ready for the hurricane that was about to hit our household. I sat calmly at our kitchen table with copies of everything laid out in front of me. The Facebook message screenshots, the DNA test results, the financial records showing her affair-related spending, and the divorce papers that would officially end our 19-year marriage. Victoria burst through the door like a Category 5 hurricane, her face twisted with rage and her designer purse swinging wildly as she slammed the divorce papers down on the kitchen table. The professional composure she usually maintained had completely evaporated, replaced by raw fury and panic. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "Are you completely insane? How dare you do this to me?" I remained seated calmly at the kitchen table, maintaining my composure despite the emotional storm that had just entered our home. "No, Victoria," I replied evenly. "For the first time in years, I'm seeing things with perfect clarity." I slid my phone across the table toward her, with the Facebook messages between her and Derek displayed on the screen. "These are your words, not mine," I said simply, letting the evidence speak for itself. Then I placed the DNA test results next to the phone, watching as her eyes darted between the two pieces of evidence that destroyed any possibility of denial or deflection. "Paternity tests don't lie, even when wives do," I continued, my voice remaining steady despite the anger building inside me. Victoria's face went completely pale as she scanned the DNA test results, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she was seeing. "No way," she stammered, desperation creeping into her voice. "This is illegal. You can't test our daughter without my consent. This won't hold up in court." "My lawyer assures me that the test is completely admissible in court," I replied calmly. "And she's not my daughter, Victoria. You thought I'd never find out, didn't you? You thought you could keep this lie going forever." She collapsed into the chair across from me, all the fight suddenly draining out of her as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "Marcus, I know how this looks, but Derek and it was just a stupid mistake," she said, attempting to salvage something from the wreckage. "He doesn't mean anything to me now. It was just, he's your true love, remember?" I interrupted, referencing her own words from the Facebook messages. "I was just the reliable backup plan, the safe choice when your first option wasn't available." I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact as I delivered the next blow. "And Jessica, were you ever planning to tell me the truth, or was I just supposed to be a convenient father figure indefinitely?" Victoria's expression changed dramatically as she realized that denying everything was pointless. The mask of victimhood fell away, replaced by something much uglier and more honest. "What did you expect?" she snapped, her voice filled with resentment that had apparently been building for years. "You spend all your time with dusty junk while I'm stuck in this nowhere town with nothing to look forward to. Derek has real ambition," she continued, her words becoming more vicious as she gained momentum. "He's going places, building something meaningful with his life. You're just a small-town shop owner who sells other people's history because you don't have the vision to make your own." The attack on my character and my life's work stung, but I'd been expecting something like this. "At least he knows how to make a woman feel wanted," she added with deliberate cruelty, trying to wound me as deeply as possible. 19 years, Victoria," I responded, keeping my voice level despite the pain her words caused. "I gave you stability, a comfortable home, financial security. I raised a child who isn't even mine. And this is how you defend yourself? By mocking the business that paid for your BMW and your designer wardrobe? The same business that funded all those trips where you were sleeping with your college boyfriend?" Victoria's face twisted with even more bitterness, as she prepared to deliver what she clearly thought would be the killing blow. "I could have had so much more than this," she hissed, gesturing around our kitchen dismissively. "But I settled for you because I thought it was the safe choice. I was wrong." Just then, Jessica walked through the front door, returning from school with her backpack slung over her shoulder. She stopped short when she saw us sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out between us, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously, looking back and forth between her mother and me, trying to gauge the situation. "Your mom can explain everything," I said quietly, maintaining my calm demeanor even though my heart was breaking. "Ask her about Derek." Jessica's eyes widened slightly, but she composed herself quickly. Too quickly for someone who was supposedly hearing this name for the first time. "Oh," she said carefully. "What about him?" "I saw the text message, Jessica," I said gently but firmly. "You already know about him, don't you?" She nodded, lifting her chin defiantly as if daring me to challenge her loyalty to her mother. "When you were snooping, you mean?" she replied with a teenage attitude. "Well, yeah, I know he's Mom's first love. It's not like you'd understand what that actually means." The words cut deeper than I'd expected, even though I'd been preparing myself for this moment for weeks. Victoria immediately moved to stand beside Jessica, placing a protective arm around her shoulders in a gesture that clearly established whose side Jessica was on. "Mom deserves someone who actually gives her attention," Jessica continued, her voice gaining confidence as she realized she had her mother's support. "Someone who cares about her dreams instead of spending all his time obsessing over old people's junk that nobody even wants anymore. Derek actually listens to her," she added, driving the knife in deeper. "He takes her to nice places and treats her like she matters. All you ever do is work on those stupid motorcycles." I stared at my daughter, the girl I had raised from birth, the teenager who was now a complete stranger to me, and felt a cold clarity wash over me. Despite the pain of her words, I found myself oddly calm, as if some part of me had been expecting this exact conversation for months. "All right," I said quietly, my voice steady and controlled. "Derek should be much more convenient for you now since he's your real father." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, the refrigerator humming, and the sound of my own heartbeat in the sudden vacuum of sound that filled the room. Jessica's expression changed from smug confidence to confusion to absolute horror in the span of just a few seconds. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "DNA doesn't lie," I replied, sliding the test results across the table toward her. "Congratulations, Jessica. You've been reunited with your biological father. Isn't that what you wanted? The real deal instead of the boring stand-in who's been taking care of you for the past 14 years? Jessica grabbed the papers with shaking hands, her eyes frantically scanning the scientific terminology that she didn't fully understand. But the conclusion was clear enough even for a 14-year-old to comprehend. She looked up at Victoria with panic in her eyes, color draining from her face as the implications began to sink in. "Mom, what is this?" she asked desperately. "What does this mean? You told me Derek was just your old boyfriend from college. You never said—" Her voice trailed off as she backed away from both of us, clutching the DNA test results to her chest. Victoria reached out toward Jessica, desperation replacing the defiance that had been in her voice just moments before. "Jessica, baby, I can explain everything," she said. But Jessica continued backing away. "Have you been lying to me my whole life?" Jessica asked, her voice rising with panic and confusion. "Is everything you've ever told me about my family a lie?" I stood up from the kitchen table, gathering my keys and wallet as I prepared to leave this nightmare behind, at least temporarily. Neither Victoria nor Jessica deserved to see how much this entire conversation was tearing me apart inside, and I needed space to process what had just happened. "I'll be staying at Tom's house tonight," I announced calmly. "You two clearly have a lot to talk about and work through." As I walked toward the front door, the screaming started behind me. Jessica's voice rose in accusation and betrayal, while Victoria made desperate attempts to explain years of deception and lies. I closed the door on 19 years of my life and drove away, their voices fading behind me as I left the wreckage of my family in my rearview mirror. Over the next 4 months, I systematically detached Victoria and Jessica from my life, financially, legally, and emotionally. It wasn't easy, and nothing about this entire process was straightforward, but I approached it with the same methodical precision I used to authenticate vintage motorcycle parts. The first priority was securing my business, which represented not just my livelihood but decades of hard work and expertise. I moved the most valuable inventory to a secure storage facility that was registered under my LLC, ensuring that none of the rare and historically significant pieces could be claimed as marital property. I updated all passwords and account access information, effectively locking Victoria out of any business-related systems she might have had access to over the years. I also removed Victoria as an authorized user on all business credit cards and updated the contact information with vendors and suppliers. None of these actions were illegal or underhanded. I was simply protecting my assets during what was clearly going to be a contentious divorce proceeding. At home, I documented everything with obsessive attention to detail. I photographed every room from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive visual record of our household contents. I noted every item of significant value and researched when each piece had been acquired, building a case for what belonged to me individually versus what we had purchased together during our marriage. I created detailed spreadsheets documenting our household expenses for the past 6 years, which clearly showed that I had personally paid for roughly 78% of our costs despite the fact that Victoria and I had similar incomes. This financial analysis would be crucial in demonstrating that I had been the primary provider for our family, while Victoria had been spending our money on her affair. I also took the precautionary step of changing the beneficiaries on my life insurance and retirement accounts, removing Victoria and Jessica and designating my brother as the primary beneficiary. I updated my will to explicitly exclude both Victoria and Jessica from any inheritance, and I had my lawyer draft power of attorney documents that would give my brother control over my affairs if I became incapacitated. The divorce proceedings moved at a frustratingly slow pace, as these things typically do. Arizona law required us to attend mediation sessions before a trial date could be set, which meant sitting across from Victoria and her attorney while we attempted to negotiate a settlement that both parties could accept. Victoria had hired Rebecca Martinez, a divorce attorney with a notorious reputation for bleeding men dry in family court. Rebecca was known throughout Tucson for her aggressive tactics and her ability to extract maximum financial settlements from wealthy husbands. When I told Kevin about Victoria's choice of representation, he just smiled confidently. "The prenup makes most of her standard playbook completely useless," Kevin assured me. "Rebecca can be as aggressive as she wants, but she can't change the legal documents that Victoria signed 19 years ago." Throughout this period, Victoria tried to gather information about my strategy through our mutual friends, attempting to gauge how much I actually knew about her affair and how far I was willing to go in the divorce proceedings. I kept my cards close to my chest, revealing nothing about the evidence I had collected or the legal strategy Kevin and I had developed. When friends asked what was happening with my marriage, I simply told them, "Victoria and I are separating, and I'd rather not discuss the details while everything is still being worked out." I let Victoria spread whatever lies or half-truths she wanted to tell people. The court would eventually see all the evidence, and that was all that really mattered. The paternity issue created additional legal complications that made the entire process even more complex. Since I had been listed on Jessica's birth certificate and had acted as her father for all 14 years of her life, legally challenging paternity at this point was an uphill battle that few men ever won. Arizona law typically has a 5-year statute of limitations on contesting paternity, which meant that under normal circumstances, I would have been completely out of luck. However, Kevin found a legal exception for cases involving fraud and deliberate deception, which applied to my situation given the Facebook messages that proved Victoria had known about Derek's potential paternity all along. Still, even with the fraud exception, the courts were extremely unlikely to completely sever the legal relationship between Jessica and me. The judicial system generally prioritizes the child's stability and well-being over biological relationships, especially when the child has lived their entire life believing someone is their father. In the end, my legal status as Jessica's father remained technically intact, but with some important stipulations that worked in my favor. Since Jessica was already 14 years old and given the extraordinary circumstances of Victoria's deception, my child support obligations were reduced to covering only basic necessities until she turned 18. There would be no college fund contributions, no car payments, no extras beyond the absolute minimum required by law. 4 weeks into the divorce proceedings, I had my first and only face-to-face conversation with Derek, and it wasn't something I had planned or wanted. It happened in the parking lot outside Kevin's office after a particularly tense mediation session that had accomplished absolutely nothing except to generate more billable hours for both sets of attorneys. Derek was waiting by Victoria's car when I walked out of the building, and I could tell immediately that this confrontation had been orchestrated. He was tall and tanned with the artificially polished appearance of someone who prioritized image over substance. Everything about him screamed, "Sales guy trying too hard to impress people." "Marcus," he called out as I walked toward my truck, trying to sound casual and friendly, despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. "You got a minute to talk?" The sheer audacity of this guy was almost impressive. He approached me with his hand extended, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee instead of two men whose lives had been destroyed by his affair with my wife. I ignored his outstretched hand completely, staring at him with the kind of cold expression that should have sent him walking in the opposite direction. "Look, man," Derek continued, apparently oblivious to my obvious hostility. "I know this whole situation is really awkward for everyone involved, but I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen the way it did." "Oh, really?" I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "How exactly did you mean for it to happen?" Derek had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he pressed on with what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "The situation just got complicated when Victoria and I reconnected. We have a lot of history together, and I'm not interested in hearing any of the bullshit excuses you're about to give me." I cut him off before he could continue. "I raised Jessica for 14 years while you were what exactly? Waiting in the wings for the right moment to swoop in and play dad?" "I didn't know about Jessica until recently," Derek said quickly, trying to defend himself. "But now that I do know, I want to step up and do the right thing. I want to be there for both of them." I actually laughed out loud at that response. I couldn't help myself. "The right thing would have been not sleeping with another man's wife," I told him bluntly. "But sure, go ahead and play dad now that all the hard work is already done." Derek tried one more time to salvage this conversation. "Look, I think Victoria, Jessica, and I can find a way to make this work. We can all be civil about this situation for Jessica's sake." That's when I'd had enough of his patronizing attitude. I stepped forward and shoved him hard against Victoria's car, watching his confident facade crumble as he realized that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Let me be absolutely clear about something," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You're welcome to them both. But don't mistake my calm demeanor for acceptance of what you've done. You're a piece of trash who helped destroy years of my life, and there's no version of this situation where we shake hands and pretend to be friends." I leaned in closer, making sure he understood exactly where things stood between us. "Now get the hell away from me before I decide to make sure you end up with some broken ribs to remember this conversation by." Derek froze against the car, finally understanding that his attempt at a friendly reconciliation had been a serious miscalculation. I walked away before I could do something that would have landed me in jail and given Victoria's attorney ammunition to use against me in court. I had a business to run and a life to rebuild, and Derek wasn't worth destroying my future over. I drove back to work after the confrontation with Derek, focusing on what really mattered. I had a business to run and a life to rebuild. There was no point in dwelling on Derek's pathetic attempts at reconciliation when I had customers to serve and employees depending on me. We finally reached a settlement agreement after 5 months of exhausting legal wrangling. The prenuptial agreement I'd insisted on 19 years earlier proved to be absolutely crucial in protecting what mattered most to me. My business and primary residence were completely protected from Victoria's claims, exactly as the document had specified. Victoria received her fair portion of our joint savings accounts, her car, and her own retirement accounts that she had accumulated during our marriage. She also got her legal share of equity in the Mountain House in Flagstaff and the downtown rental property that we had purchased together during our marriage as investment properties. I kept the primary residence where I'd been living, the motorcycle parts business that represented my life's work, my truck, and my personal retirement accounts. I also negotiated to buy out Victoria's shares of the 2 investment properties, which required me to part with a significant chunk of my liquid assets but kept both properties under my complete control. It wasn't the clean victory I had initially hoped for, but considering Arizona's community property laws, it was actually a solid outcome that protected the most important elements of my financial future. I kept everything that truly mattered to me and walked away with peace of mind, which was worth far more than the money I'd spent to make Victoria disappear from my life permanently. The day after our divorce was officially finalized, Victoria and Jessica moved out of the house. I had expected them to find an apartment somewhere in Tucson while they figured out their next steps. But instead, they moved directly to Scottsdale to live with Derek. Apparently, while our divorce proceedings had been grinding through the legal system, Derek had been busy setting up their perfect new life together, promising Victoria a fresh start away from what she'd always considered the boring small-town existence of Tucson. Jessica left without saying goodbye to me. She simply packed her belongings while I was at the shop working and disappeared from my life as completely as if she had never been part of it. I came home to find her room empty, with no note, no explanation, and no acknowledgement of the 14 years I had spent raising her as my own daughter. You know what the strangest part was? The overwhelming sense of relief that washed over me once they were both gone. After months of tension, lies, legal battles, and emotional manipulation, the silence in the house felt almost sacred. I walked from room to room that first night, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years. finally able to exist in my own space without constantly walking on eggshells or wondering what lies were being told behind my back. With Victoria and Jessica completely out of my life, I began rebuilding my existence with the same methodical precision I used in my business. I started by remodeling the house, systematically changing all the things that Victoria had always insisted on, but that had never reflected my personal taste or preferences. I painted the living room the deep forest green that Victoria had consistently vetoed over the years, claiming it was too dark and masculine for her taste. I replaced her formal dining room setup with a regulation-size pool table, creating a space where I could actually relax and entertain friends instead of hosting the pretentious dinner parties that Victoria had always preferred. I converted what had been Victoria's meditation room into a proper home office, complete with filing systems for business records and space to work on authentication projects that required detailed research and documentation. The house gradually started feeling like my home again, rather than a space where I was merely a tolerated guest. I installed a vintage motorcycle-themed bar in the den, complete with an authentic barback that I'd purchased from a defunct Nevada casino. I hung up my collection of vintage bike parts that Victoria had always insisted should remain hidden away in display cases, claiming they made the house look like a cluttered garage. I bought a state-of-the-art sound system and played my music as loud as I wanted, whenever I wanted, without worrying about complaints or criticism. These might seem like small freedoms to most people, but after 19 years of having my preferences constantly overruled and dismissed, they felt absolutely revolutionary. For the first time in decades, I was living in a space that truly reflected who I was and what I valued. The business thrived without the constant financial drain of Victoria's excessive spending and her affair-related expenses. I expanded our online presence by hiring a digital marketing specialist who understood the vintage motorcycle community and could reach collectors nationwide. I started attending major vintage bike shows across the Southwest, building relationships with serious collectors and establishing our shop as a premier destination for authenticated parts and memorabilia. The profits increased by 28% in just 7 months, proving that my business instincts had been sound all along. Without Victoria's constant demands for expensive trips, designer clothes, and luxury purchases that served no practical purpose, I could reinvest in inventory and equipment that actually generated income and built long-term value. My brother came to stay with me for a few weeks during the transition period, helping with the remodel and making sure I was eating properly and not drinking too much while I processed everything that had happened. It was exactly the kind of practical support I needed during those first few months of rebuilding my life from scratch. Kevin and I developed an actual friendship that extended beyond our professional relationship. We started meeting weekly for poker nights with other divorced men who had survived similar marital disasters and come out stronger on the other side. These gatherings became an invaluable source of practical advice and emotional support from men who understood exactly what I was going through. My neighbor Carl, a retired firefighter whose wife had left him several years earlier under similar circumstances, became an unexpected source of wisdom and perspective. He'd been through his own version of this nightmare and had emerged as a genuinely happy and fulfilled person, which gave me hope that I could do the same. There was absolutely no contact from either Victoria or Jessica during this period. I heard through mutual friends that they were settling into their new life in Scottsdale and that Derek had managed to get Victoria a job at his real estate firm, probably using his connections to help her start over professionally. I also heard that Jessica had apparently transferred to a private school where she was supposedly thriving academically and socially. I didn't ask for any additional updates after receiving this basic information. Some wounds heal much better when you stop picking at them and allow time to do its work naturally. Almost exactly 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I was at the shop appraising a collection of vintage Indian motorcycle manuals that a collector had brought in from Phoenix. It was routine work that I enjoyed, the kind of detailed authentication that required expertise and patience. When the bell above the front door jingled, I looked up with my standard customer service smile ready, expecting to see another collector or enthusiast. The smile died on my face when I saw Victoria and Jessica standing there in my shop. Victoria looked completely different from the polished woman I had been married to for 19 years. The designer clothes that had been her armor for so long were gone, replaced by discount store business casual attire that looked tired and worn. She had lost the artificial polish and confidence that had defined her appearance throughout our marriage, and there was something defeated about her posture that I'd never seen before. Jessica stood slightly behind her mother, keeping her eyes downcast and avoiding direct eye contact with me. She had lost a significant amount of weight since I'd last seen her, and there was a hardness to her face that hadn't been there before. She looked older than her 15 years, as if the past year had aged her in ways that went far beyond normal teenage development. "Marcus," Victoria started, taking a tentative step forward into my shop. "Please, can we talk? I know you're probably busy, but this will just take a minute." I set down the vintage Indian motorcycle manuals I had been examining, maintaining my professional composure despite the shock of seeing them both in my space. "I'm with customers right now," I replied calmly, gesturing toward an elderly couple who were browsing through my collection of vintage Harley-Davidson parts. "It'll just take a minute," Victoria pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. "We've made a terrible mistake, Marcus. Everything that happened was wrong, and we need to talk about fixing this. Derek wasn't my problem then, and he's not my problem now." I cut her off firmly, making it clear that I had no intention of discussing their personal drama while I was trying to run my business. "The shop closes at 7 o'clock. Please," Jessica spoke for the first time, her voice small and uncertain in a way that immediately transported me back to when she was a child. "Dad?" The word hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I hadn't heard Jessica call me Dad in over a year. Hadn't expected to ever hear it again after everything that had happened between us. For just a moment, my professional composure wavered as a flood of memories threatened to overwhelm me. 7 o'clock, I repeated, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand, rather than the emotional manipulation that was clearly being attempted. "Victoria, you can wait outside in the parking lot or in your car. Those are the only terms under which I'm willing to have this conversation." "What?" Victoria's voice rose with indignation. "I'm not leaving my daughter alone with you after everything that's happened. You can't expect me to just... You wait outside or in your car or this conversation doesn't happen at all," I interrupted, making it clear that these were non-negotiable conditions. "Those are my terms, and they're the only terms you're going to get." After a moment of tense silence, Victoria nodded stiffly and walked out of the shop, clearly unhappy with the arrangement but desperate enough to accept my conditions. Jessica hovered uncertainly by the door, unsure whether she was welcome to stay or expected to leave with her mother. "You can stay if you want," I told her, returning to my work with the vintage manuals. "Look around, browse the inventory. We close at 7. For the next 2 hours, I continued working while keeping one eye on Jessica as she wandered through the store. She occasionally touched items that she had once helped me catalog, pieces that held memories of our father-daughter time together when she was younger and more interested in learning about vintage motorcycles. The elderly couple eventually made their purchase and left, followed by 3 more customers who came and went throughout the afternoon. At exactly 7 o'clock, I locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. "Let's take a walk," I told Jessica. "There's a park down the street where we can talk privately." We walked in silence through the warm Arizona evening air, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains that surrounded Tucson. I noticed Victoria watching us from her car across the street, but I didn't acknowledge her presence or give any indication that I cared about her surveillance. At the park, we sat on a bench under a sprawling mesquite tree, surrounded by the kind of desert landscape that had always felt like home to me. Jessica twisted her hands nervously in her lap, a habit she'd had since childhood that brought back memories of countless conversations we'd had in similar settings over the years. "Derek left us," Jessica finally said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since we'd left the shop. 4 months ago, he cleaned out Mom's bank account and disappeared without any warning or explanation. She continued, her voice gaining strength as she began to tell me what had really happened during their year in Scottsdale. "Once we moved in with him, we saw his true colors pretty quickly. The whole act that he'd been putting on during the affair dropped almost immediately. He said he never signed up for dealing with a clingy ex-girlfriend and a teenage daughter who wasn't even grateful for everything he was trying to do for us." I remained silent, watching a pair of roadrunners dart between the cacti in the distance, while Jessica worked up the courage to tell me the full story of their disastrous year with Derek. "We found out later that he'd maxed out his credit cards and had been seeing another woman in Phoenix," she continued. "She has a kid of her own, and apparently Derek had been promising her the same things he'd been promising Mom about their future together. That's one thing I've learned over the years, whether I'm negotiating for a rare vintage motorcycle part or having a conversation like this one. You always let the other party lay out their complete position before you respond." Jessica clearly had more to tell me, and I needed to hear all of it before I decided how to react. "We had to sell the condo we were living in because Mom couldn't afford the mortgage payments on her own," Jessica admitted, shame evident in her voice. "The job Derek got her at his real estate firm disappeared as soon as he left town. Mom's been working 2 jobs just to pay rent on a small apartment, but even that's not enough. She took a shaky breath before continuing. We've been staying with Mom's friend in Mesa for the past few weeks, but that arrangement is ending soon because her friend needs the space for her own family. Still, I waited. There was clearly more coming, and I could tell that Jessica was working up to asking me for something specific. In situations like this, patience is always your best strategy. I lost my spot at the private school in Scottsdale, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We couldn't afford the tuition anymore, and the public school in our district it's not a good place. I've fallen behind academically, and I'm worried about my future. The mention of Jessica's education hit me harder than I had expected it to. Education had always been a priority for me, and I had been setting aside money for Jessica's college fund since she was a baby. The 529 education plan I'd established years ago was still intact, with me as the sole custodian. Victoria's name wasn't on the account, and it hadn't been mentioned in our divorce agreement, so the money was still there waiting for Jessica if she ever needed it. Finally, I looked directly at Jessica for the first time since we'd sat down. "Why are you telling me all of this?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. Jessica's eyes immediately filled with tears as she prepared to deliver what was clearly the most difficult part of this conversation. "Because I made a horrible mistake and so did Mom," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Mom told me all these romantic stories about Derek, about how he was her first real love and how passionate their relationship had been when they were younger. She made it sound like you were the villain who was keeping her trapped in a boring, small-town life," Jessica continued, the words tumbling out faster now as she tried to explain her betrayal. "She painted this picture of Derek as this successful, ambitious man who was going to give us a better life. And I believed her because it was easier than admitting that my mom was lying to me about everything." Jessica broke down completely then, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as the weight of her guilt and regret overwhelmed her. "I didn't know the truth about Derek being my biological father until you showed me those DNA test results," she whispered through her tears. "Mom never told me that part of the story. She just kept talking about him like he was some kind of romantic hero. And now," she continued, her voice barely audible, "now I know what I threw away. I had a dad who loved me, who taught me things, who was always there for me even when I was awful to him. And I threw it all away for some fantasy that Mom created in her head." She broke down completely then, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as years of guilt and regret finally overwhelmed her. On pure instinct, I reached out and put my arm around her, the same gesture I'd made countless times when she was younger and facing problems that seemed insurmountable at the time. Jessica collapsed against me, crying in earnest now, her body trembling with the force of emotions she'd clearly been holding back for months. "I'm so sorry," she choked out between sobs, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything I said and did. I'm sorry for choosing them over you." I held her while she cried, my own eyes burning with unshed tears as I struggled to process the complex mix of emotions coursing through me. Part of me wanted to comfort the child I'd raised, while another part of me remembered the pain and betrayal I'd experienced when she'd chosen Victoria and Derek over the man who had actually been there for her entire life. When Jessica finally quieted down and her sobbing subsided, I spoke carefully, knowing that my next words would shape whatever relationship we might have going forward. "I can't undo the past year, Jessica," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. "I can't pretend that what you and your mother did didn't happen, and I can't just forget how much it hurt when you both abandoned me." She nodded against my shoulder, understanding that there would be consequences for the choices she'd made. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I know I can't take back the things I said. But you're still my kid," I continued, the words coming easier than I had expected them to. I spent months trying to shut down that part of myself, trying to convince myself that our relationship didn't matter anymore. But seeing you now, talking to you like this, I realized that DNA doesn't change 14 years of shared history. I know what's real between us, and I know what actually matters. Hope flickered in Jessica's eyes as she looked up at me, hardly daring to believe that reconciliation might be possible. "Really?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Really?" I confirmed, but then I held up a hand to indicate that there would be conditions. "But I have some non-negotiable requirements if we're going to rebuild our relationship." Jessica straightened up, wiping her eyes and preparing to hear what I expected from her. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'll do whatever it takes. First, you finish high school with no excuses and no dropping out," I said firmly. "Education has always been important to me, and it's going to be important for your future. Whatever problems you're having academically, we'll figure out how to fix them. Second, You get a part-time job and start saving money for college, I continued. I want you to understand the value of work and learn how to support yourself. You're not going to coast through life expecting other people to pay your way. Third, and this is crucial, I said, looking directly into her eyes to make sure she understood how serious I was about this point. You deal with me directly from now on. No more going through Victoria, no more family drama, no more choosing sides. If you want my help and support, then our relationship is between you and me, period. I paused for a moment before adding the final condition. We're also going to sit down with Kevin, my lawyer, to put some of these arrangements in writing. I need legal protection this time, and you need structure and clear expectations. We're both going to know exactly where we stand. Jessica nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that I was willing to give her another chance despite everything that had happened. What about Mom? She asked hesitantly, glancing across the street toward where Victoria was still waiting in her car. That bridge is completely burned, Jessica, I said without hesitation. Victoria is an adult who made her choices, and she's going to have to live with the consequences. I'll help you because you're young and you made mistakes, but she's on her own from here on out. Jessica looked across the street toward her mother's car, seeming to understand the reality of the situation. After a moment, she turned back to me with resolve in her eyes. Okay, she agreed quietly. I can live with that arrangement. We walked back toward the shop together, our steps lighter than they had been when we'd left for the park. At the corner, I stopped and turned to Jessica one more time. You need to go tell your mother what my terms are, I said firmly. If you want to come back to Tucson, if you want my help rebuilding your life, then she stays completely out of my life. That's not negotiable. Jessica nodded, understanding the seriousness of what I was asking. I understand, she said simply. I watched as Jessica crossed the street to Victoria's car and saw the animated conversation that took place through the windshield. Victoria's expressions shifted rapidly from hope to anger to what looked like resignation as Jessica explained my conditions. After several minutes of intense discussion, Jessica got out of the car and walked back toward me. She agrees to your terms, Jessica said simply, though I could tell from her expression that Victoria hadn't been happy about the arrangement. The following week, Kevin filed a custody modification with the court to reflect our new living arrangement. Victoria didn't contest the filing, probably because she was relieved to have one less financial responsibility to worry about in her current situation. The judge signed off on the modification quickly, since Jessica was old enough to speak for herself about where she wanted to live, and she had clearly stated her preference to return to Tucson with me. Victoria retained her legal visitation rights, but from what I could tell, she rarely exercised them. The occasional phone call or lunch meeting seemed to be the extent of their ongoing relationship, which was probably better for everyone involved. You can stay in the guest room until we figure out something more permanent, I told Jessica, as I showed her around the house that had been transformed during her absence. I'll help you get enrolled back in your old school next week, and we'll assess where you are academically so we can address any gaps. Jessica wasn't the same girl who had left a year earlier. Too much had happened. Too many harsh lessons had been learned for her to simply return to being the child she'd been before Victoria's affair destroyed our family. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe she could become someone new and stronger, forged from the wreckage of her mother's lies and deception. That night, as I showed Jessica to the guest room that would be hers for the foreseeable future, she paused in the doorway and turned back to me. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Thank you for giving me another chance when I didn't deserve it. Make it count, I replied simply, knowing that actions would matter more than words in the weeks and months ahead. Over the next few weeks, Jessica and I gradually fell into a new rhythm that was different from our previous relationship but steady and honest in ways that felt sustainable. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it represented a foundation that we could build on together. I set clear expectations for Jessica's behavior and academic performance. She had to be home by 10 o'clock on school nights, maintain at least a B average in all her classes, and contribute to household chores like any family member should. These weren't punishments. They were the kind of structure that every teenager needs to develop responsibility and self-discipline. Jessica found a part-time job at a bookstore near her school, working weekends and some afternoons when her schedule permitted. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave her spending money and taught her valuable lessons about reliability, customer service, and the satisfaction that comes from earning your own way in the world. For her 16th birthday, I helped Jessica set up a modest investment account where she could deposit a portion of her earnings from the bookstore. I taught her the basics of compound interest and long-term financial planning, skills that I wished someone had taught me when I was her age. By the time Jessica graduated from high school, she had saved enough money from her part-time job to purchase a decent used car. I matched her savings as a graduation gift, not because I was legally obligated to do so, but because I wanted to acknowledge the effort and responsibility she had demonstrated over the past 2 years. Jessica enrolled in community college for her first 2 years, planning to transfer to a state university to complete her business degree. The 5 on 29 education fund I had established when she was a baby was still intact, and it would cover most of her educational expenses if she continued to demonstrate the kind of academic commitment she'd shown since returning to live with me. So that's my story. Not one I ever expected to tell, and certainly not one I ever imagined living through when I was a young man planning what I thought would be a straightforward life with the woman I loved. It turns out that the foundations of my entire adult existence were built on quicksand, shifting and unstable in ways I never could have anticipated. But now, after everything that's happened, I'm finally standing on bedrock. The motorcycle parts shop is expanding in ways I never thought possible during the chaos of my divorce. We're opening a second location in Flagstaff next month, which will allow us to serve collectors throughout northern Arizona and tap into the tourist market that visits the area year-round. The business growth has exceeded all my expectations, and I've been able to hire additional staff and invest in inventory that I never would have been able to afford when Victoria was draining our resources on her affair. The house truly feels like mine again, transformed from a space where I felt like a reluctant guest into a home that reflects my personality, interests, and values. Every room tells the story of who I actually am rather than who someone else thought I should be. It's a sanctuary where I can relax, work on projects, and entertain friends without constantly worrying about criticism or judgment. My relationship with Jessica is fundamentally different from what it was before Victoria's betrayal, but in many ways it's more honest and authentic now. We're both more guarded in some respects, having learned hard lessons about trust and loyalty, but we're also more genuine with each other. There's no pretense between us anymore. We both understand that relationships require effort and commitment from both parties. Jessica has grown into a young woman who understands the value of hard work and personal responsibility. The entitled teenager who once dismissed my life's work as boring old junk has been replaced by someone who appreciates the expertise and dedication required to build something meaningful. She may never share my passion for vintage motorcycles, but she respects what I've accomplished and understands that it represents far more than just a way to make money. Victoria remains firmly on the periphery of our new life, exactly where she belongs. She calls Jessica occasionally, and they meet for lunch about once a month. But she respects the boundaries I've established and doesn't attempt to insert herself into our day-to-day existence. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the woman I originally married in the stories Jessica shares about their brief interactions. But those moments just remind me how far we've all traveled from where we started. I hear through the grapevine that Victoria is still struggling financially and professionally, working multiple jobs to make ends meet in a city where she doesn't have the kind of established reputation and connections that took me decades to build in Tucson. I don't take any pleasure in her difficulties, but I don't feel any responsibility to help her either. She made her choices, and now she's living with the consequences just like the rest of us. Here's what I've learned through this entire devastating experience. A man builds his life based on what he believes to be true about the people closest to him and the foundation of his family. When those fundamental truths crumble beneath him, he faces a choice that will define the rest of his existence. He can either crumble along with those failed foundations, allowing bitterness and betrayal to destroy him, or he can build something stronger and more authentic on firmer ground. The process of rebuilding isn't easy, and it's not quick. It requires the same kind of methodical patience and attention to detail that I use when authenticating vintage motorcycle parts. You have to carefully examine every component, test its authenticity, and determine whether it's worth preserving or if it needs to be discarded and replaced with something better. I've come to understand that I am the architect of my own happiness and fulfillment. No one else can build that for me, and no one else can destroy it without my permission. The strongest and most lasting structures in life rise from the ashes of what came before, built by people who refuse to let betrayal and disappointment define their future. The vintage motorcycle parts business has taught me that some things become more valuable over time, not despite the wear and damage they've endured, but because of it. The patina, the small imperfections, the evidence of a hard life lived authentically. These things add character and worth rather than diminishing value. The same principle applies to people who survive devastating betrayals and emerge stronger on the other side. Jessica and I both carry scars from what Victoria put us through. But those scars represent survival and growth rather than permanent damage. We've learned to trust carefully, to value loyalty when we find it, and to appreciate the relationships that prove themselves authentic under pressure. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the 19 years I spent with Victoria, or if I consider them wasted time. The answer is more complicated than they expect. I regret the lies and the deception, and I regret the pain that Jessica and I both endured when the truth finally came out. But I don't regret the experiences that taught me who I really am and what I'm actually capable of surviving. Those 19 years weren't wasted. They were the education I needed to become the man I am today. They taught me the importance of protecting myself legally and financially, the value of having genuine friends who support you during difficult times, and the difference between relationships built on genuine connection versus those built on convenience and illusion. Most importantly, they taught me that love and family aren't just about biology or legal documents. The relationship Jessica and I have rebuilt is based on choice, effort, and mutual respect rather than obligation or assumption. We choose to be in each other's lives because we value what we've built together, not because we're trapped by circumstances beyond our control. I'm 41 years old now, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm living entirely on my own terms. The business is thriving, the house reflects my personality and values, and my relationship with Jessica is honest and authentic in ways that our previous dynamic never was. I've learned to find satisfaction in solitude and to appreciate the peace that comes from not having to constantly navigate someone else's deception and drama. Would I be open to finding love again someday? Maybe, but only with someone who demonstrates the kind of integrity and honesty that I now know are absolutely essential for any lasting relationship. I'm no longer willing to compromise on fundamental values or to ignore red flags for the sake of maintaining an illusion of domestic happiness. The most valuable lesson I've learned is that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most profound freedom. When everything you thought you knew about your life turns out to be built on lies, you have the opportunity to rebuild from scratch according to your own authentic vision of what matters. That's where I am today, standing on solid ground that I built myself, surrounded by people who have proven their loyalty under pressure, doing work that I'm passionate about in a space that truly feels like home. It's not the life I planned when I was 22 years old and getting married, but it's a life that's entirely mine, and that makes all the difference in the world.